OSHA estimates that 238,000 establishments have permit-required confined spaces. These establishments employ approximately 1.6 million workers, including contractors, who enter 4.8 million permit-required confined spaces each year. OSHA further estimates that 63 fatalities and 13,000 lost workdays and non-lost workday cases involving permit-required confined space entries occur annually. Confined spaces pose hazards that must be considered and controlled before and during any confined space entry. Here are some of the topics we'll cover in this segment. What is a confined space? Confined space labeling, pre-entry requirements, confined space attendants and their responsibilities, confined space entrance, hazards of confined spaces, electrical equipment, ventilation, atmospheric testing, compressed gas cylinders, hot work permits, lockout, tagout, and confined space rescue. What is a confined space? There are basically two types of confined space: non-permit required confined spaces and permit required confined spaces. A non-permit required confined space meets the following conditions. The space has adequate size and configuration for an employee to bodily enter. The space has a limited means of entry and escape, and the space is not intended for continuous human occupancy. OSHA uses the term permit-required confined space to describe those spaces which meet both the definition of confined space and also pose additional health or safety hazards. Some hazards include mechanical, physical, or atmospheric hazards, inward-sloping walls such as a space that's funnel-shaped which may trap an entrant. The space may contain any material that could engulf an entrant, such as a grain silo or similar types of vessels, or by its nature, the space could become immediately dangerous to life and health, or IDLH. All confined spaces must be considered as IDLH until proven otherwise by recognized methods such as atmospheric monitoring. If an employer requires workers to enter confined spaces, the employer must have a written confined space program. Confined space labeling. All permit-required confined spaces must be labeled by posting danger signs or any other equally effective means. A sign reading "Danger, permit-required confined space, do not enter," or using other similar language would satisfy the requirement for confined space labeling. Simply placing red barricade tape wouldn't satisfy this requirement because the tape doesn't explain the hazard. Pre-entry requirements. Before entering or working in a permit-required confined space, an entry permit must be properly filled out prior to anyone entering the space. A confined space entry permit gives employees written authorization for entry into a confined space under established conditions for a stated purpose during a specific work shift. Attendants and entrants should review the permit before starting work. Every affected person must be knowledgeable of the hazards in the confined space, and an effective means of communication between the attendant and entrants must be present and tested. There must also be an effective means of summoning help and rescue if needed. Confined space attendants. Whenever there are entrants in a confined space, even for a short period, a confined space attendant properly trained in emergency procedures must be present outside the confined space at all times. A confined space attendant shall have no other duties than to monitor authorized entrants and to be alert to changes that may affect conditions inside the space. The confined space attendant must never leave their post until all confined space entrants have been evacuated. The attendant should never attempt an entry rescue. If a rescue needs to be initiated, a means such as a plant ERT or local fire department should be arranged. Over 70% of people who die in confined spaces are would-be rescuers. This happens when workers enter a confined space in an attempt to rescue a coworker who's been incapacitated for some reason. Most likely, fallen workers have been overcome by an unsafe atmosphere. Those who rush in to perform a rescue without line-supplied air or a self-contained breathing apparatus are also overcome and become a fatality statistic. During an emergency, all confined spaces must be evacuated. Confined space attendant responsibilities. The attendant arguably has the most amount of responsibility on the confined space team, since they have the highest number of duties required by OSHA. These duties are to know the hazards. In the case of the attendant, this can often include using air monitoring equipment to keep a close watch on the atmospheric conditions inside the confined space and communicate any changes observed. They have to know the behavioral effects of the hazards and be able to identify the authorized entrants, remain outside until relieved, communicate with entrants throughout the work period, monitor and evacuate entrants if necessary, summon rescue if needed, and warn away unauthorized persons. Confined space entrance. If any part of your body, such as your hand, foot, head, etc., breaks the plane of the confined space opening, you're considered to have entered. When entering a confined space, it's always a good practice to wear a full body harness or appropriate rescue gear that fits properly in order to facilitate faster rescue. In some applications, a harness may not be as applicable as perhaps ankle or wrist type rescue devices. Hazards of confined spaces. Hazardous atmospheres encountered in confined spaces can be divided into 4 distinct categories: flammable, toxic, irritant, corrosive, and asphyxiating. Asphyxiation is the most common cause of death and injuries in confined spaces, and a hazardous atmosphere is the most common cause of asphyxiation. Our normal atmosphere is composed of approximately 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and 1% argon with small amounts of various other gases. Reduction of oxygen in a confined space may be the result of either consumption, displacement, or chemical reaction. Working in an atmosphere with oxygen levels between 14% and 17% can produce impaired judgment, dizziness, fatigue, and collapse. In oxygen levels lower than this, the one breath you take could have so little oxygen that your muscles can't respond and you won't have enough strength to escape even if you're still conscious. Here are some common causes of oxygen deficiency in a confined space. Oxygen is used up when metals rust. Oxygen is used up during combustion, for example, by propane space heaters or during cutting or welding. Oxygen can be replaced by other gases, for example, welding gases, or gases forced into confined space to prevent corrosion. Microorganisms use up oxygen, for example, in sewer lines and fermentation vessels. Too much oxygen is not as common a hazard as low oxygen, but it's also dangerous. This is known as an oxygen-enriched atmosphere. Too much oxygen greatly increases the risk of fire or explosion in the confined space. Materials that wouldn't normally catch fire or burn in normal air may do so extremely quickly and easily where there's a high level of oxygen. An atmosphere with an oxygen concentration in excess of 23.5% is considered oxygen-enriched. Workers must not enter a confined space with an oxygen-enriched atmosphere. The only safe way to find out whether air in a confined space has enough oxygen is to use a properly calibrated and maintained monitor. Workers must not enter a confined space containing less than 19.5% oxygen without taking appropriate precautions, including the use of supplied air respirators. Contaminants in the air can result in an atmosphere that is toxic to workers and may result in injury or death. Some toxic gases typically found in confined spaces are carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide or H2S, nitrogen, and many others. Any of these contaminants can cause death by asphyxiation. Mechanical hazards may also exist in confined spaces. All hazards must be evaluated and neutralized before entry. Lockout, tagout. Lockout, tagout procedures must be used to isolate the confined space from unexpected release of energy. All employees entering a confined space are required to attach their personal safety locks to the designated isolation points or group lockout device if one is being used. Hot work permits. A hot work permit must be completed for any spark or heat generating activities inside a confined space. Hot work must be monitored by a fire watch during and in some instances for a period after the work is completed. Hot work in a confined space can have inherent hazards such as possible buildup of explosive gases, oxygen-enriched atmosphere, oxygen-deficient atmosphere, and fire. When conducting hot work in a permit-required confined space, continuous atmospheric monitoring must be conducted. Compressed gas cylinders. Never bring compressed gas cylinders into the confined space, and never block the exit with the equipment. During breaks and overnight, shut down all gas equipment. All gas welding lines must be removed from the confined space. Gas cylinder valves must be shut off and gas lines relieved of all pressure. Atmospheric testing. Atmospheric testing must be performed before entering a confined space and prior to re-entry, for example, following lunch breaks or if a problem exists. When testing the atmosphere inside a confined space, be sure to check the top, middle, and bottom of the space since gases may be lighter or heavier than air. It's always a good idea for the confined space attendant to be present when air monitoring is being conducted. Ventilation. If concentrations of toxic agents or oxygen contents are found to be at harmful levels, the confined space must be ventilated to bring the atmosphere to safe levels before entry. If the concentration of contaminants remain at harmful levels after ventilation, line-supplied air or self-contained breathing apparatus may have to be worn to ensure a safe air supply. Prior to ventilating a confined space, atmospheric testing should be conducted for all suspected hazards. Retest to ensure that the atmosphere is safe. If the atmosphere won't stay in a safe range without mechanical ventilation, extra precautions must be taken. Confined space rescue. Earlier I stated that a means for rescue of entrants must be readily available to confined space attendants. This may be a retrieval device if appropriate for the application. In other confined space entries, it will be necessary to prearrange for a specially trained team to execute a confined space rescue. Rescue planning is critical. An unplanned rescue could be the attendant's last one if it's not thoroughly planned. It's estimated that 70% of all confined space fatalities are would-be rescuers who rushed into a confined space and also died with those they attempted to rescue. OSHA requires that an emergency confined space rescue team, or CSRT, is provided on site or has the capability to be summoned to perform a rescue and respond to the emergency in no more than 10 to 15 minutes. It's not enough to simply state that the local fire department is your planned CSRT. Many fire departments don't have proper training and may not be relied upon for this type of rescue. In the planning phase, the local agency must be contacted to determine their rescue capabilities. The CSRT must have adequate means of communication with the confined space entrants and attendants so they can respond should an emergency occur. The CSRT is to have required equipment such as PPE, atmospheric monitoring and testing equipment, communication equipment, alarm systems, and rescue equipment to meet compliance. Electrical equipment. Electrical equipment inside a confined space must be protected by a ground fault circuit interrupter, or GFCI, or workers may use tools requiring power not greater than 24 volts. Whenever a GFCI is used, it must always be plugged in at the power source outside the confined space. Review. We've covered the following: determining what a confined space is, pre-entry requirements, confined space attendants and their duties, hazardous atmospheres and asphyxiation, lockout, tagout, hot work and permitting, atmospheric testing, ventilation, confined space rescue, and electrical equipment in confined spaces. If you have any questions or are unsure about anything regarding confined space safety, ask your safety manager.